started right on time. So I see definitely a bunch of familiar faces in here, but some people I'm not as familiar with. So for those people I'm not as familiar with, I'm Maya Brown. I'm the new coordinator of program operations at LWA. I started as an intern over the summer, so I'm very familiar with a lot of the water quality monitoring work, and working on the lake. I've also lived here my whole life and grew up in Meredith, so I'm very familiar with the lake as well. And I took over a lot of the responsibilities that Bree has. So she kind of did all that stuff, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with her. And now she stepped into a new role as associate director. So she's doing great things, and I'm kind of taking on some of the other stuff that she had been doing. So yeah, I'm really happy to meet you all and kind of get things kicked off here. So I'm really excited for you guys to see all the hard work and everything that you guys put together over last season. And then you can kind of see the overview trends, and just all your hard work put together. So from there, I'll pass it on to Bob. And before I do, I just want to say if you guys could all mute your mics for the meeting, that would be great. And if you have any questions, you can absolutely throw them in the chat, or you can ask them at the end of it. We'll kind of give a little Q&A session if anybody has any questions as well. And thank you for being here. So Bob, take it away whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, thank you everybody for tuning into this. I'm Bob Craycraft with the University of New Hampshire Lakeside Monitoring Program. I coordinate the program. I've been around since 1988. I started as an undergraduate here at University of New Hampshire, and then took on a position with Cooperative Extension and just took on various roles, but always affiliated with the Lakeside Monitoring Program. So I do have personal experience with various locations around Lake Winnipesaukee. I can't say I've been to every single nook and cranny because it is a big lake, as you all know, with many coves and bays. But I've seen quite a bit of the lake, and I've certainly seen the data. So what I was asked to do today is kind of walk through some of the 2025 results. I'm going to also just give a background overview. With a big lake like this, with so many sites, it's hard to hit upon every single site. So I'm going to hit upon some general areas of the lake, and then always we can take questions to talk more specifically about areas you may be interested in. So let me just share my screen here. Oops. Sorry about that. Let's do this again. I have dual monitor, which is making it a little bit confusing for me. Oops. Share. There we go. All right. So hopefully my screen is shared. Let me start this slideshow.
Yep, we can see it, Bob.
Well, you're gonna see the image with the subsequent slide coming up. Hopefully this will work. Dual screen makes it a little complex sometimes. But I've been asked to give an overview of the 2025 Lake Winnipesaukee data. And for those that are part of the monitoring program, I think you're well aware that the data are being used to develop watershed management plans for the sub-watersheds of Lake Winnipesaukee, and also have been done for a number of lakes within the watershed, Lake Winnipesaukee, Lake Kennesaca, so on and so forth. So the data get quite a bit of use to help inform decision makers around the lake. So I just wanted to kind of start with that. What I always like to do is talk a little bit about the natural process of lake aging. We call it eutrophication, just a jargon term, but over a geological time frame, lakes become more nutrient rich. They become less clear, more aquatic plant growth around the periphery of the lakes. Oxygen goes from a younger lake, high oxygen throughout the water column, to lower oxygen as the lake ages. So this will happen to all of our lakes. It happens on a geological time frame, and it's a natural process. Some lakes are further along in the process than others, just naturally, but certainly when we have a lot of human influence in a watershed, if we're not careful, we can exacerbate the rate of that change. Also, short-term disasters like high wind events that uproot trees and cause erosion Those can also contribute to things. And there's also the weather impacts that vary from year to year, which may not necessarily be directly related to the eutrophication process, but they have some implications in terms of how the lake's responding to changing conditions, nutrient enrichment. One of the things we do know, based on a lot of scientific studies, is that the nutrient phosphorus is the driving nutrient for growth in our freshwater systems. And there are some other nutrients that are important too, nitrogen certainly. But there are a lot of national studies that have been done on this. And this was just a local a science experiment somebody over at Lake Wentworth did, or somebody's daughter did over at Lake Wentworth. But it took lake water, which is on the left here, or my left. And then, so that's just the natural Lake Wentworth water. And then these are just different nutrient additions, fertilizer additions. And this is a ratio of phosphorus to nitrogen to potassium. So when you see a 0 there in the middle, that's the phosphorus number. So no phosphorus was added, but nitrogen and potassium, and all these others have phosphorus. But what you can see from that is you start adding these nutrients, things are going to change. And anytime you're adding phosphorus, in this case, these 4 nutrient additions all had phosphorus, they turned greener. And the one that didn't have phosphorus, it certainly changed. So there's no doubt about that. But there's a different qualitative component to what you're seeing there. But the bottom line is we understand very well that phosphorus is a driver to growth in our systems. When we're doing water quality monitoring, what we really want to do is get long-term data, trend data. What we find is if you go out to a water body at any given time through the summer, the conditions can vary tremendously. In some lakes more so than others, but there are these patterns we can see among months in some lakes, or seasonality. But the point here is if you take one sample each time, let's say late August, it'll, in this particular case, and this is based on some data we collected over at Little Squam Lake years ago, but it gives you the pattern, or what appears to be a trend of decreasing growth. So this is a chlorophyll A content that we're looking at, so how green the water is. But just looking at those August samples, it tends to suggest that things are improving, if you will, at least from a contact recreation standpoint. Less green water, you're more inclined to water ski, swim in that, so on and so forth. But if we instead take multiple samples any given year and go over a longer time frame, so instead of a 5-year cycle, we're going 10 years. Instead of 1 sample per season, we're grabbing 16. In this particular case, they did weekly sampling. You can see there's a very different pattern that becomes evident. Things are actually getting greener, not less green. And obviously, there's a lot of noise in any given year. So what you need are multiple measurements over time to differentiate the signal from the noise. Things vary tremendously from week to week, particularly if you have particularly dry spells or particularly wet periods. We oftentimes see the water quality change. When we're working with water quality, we're working at the watershed scale. And I unfortunately didn't have a nice 3D image of Lake Winnipesaukee, but here's Newfound Lake. And similar to Newfound, you have your Belknap Range, you have the Ospey Mountains around you. You have a lot of higher elevation peaks, and anything that falls on the Lake Winnipesaukee side of those peaks is going to ultimately make its way into the lake. So here you can see the watershed of Newfound Lake. Well, obviously you have a similar watershed based on the configuration of those mountains and hills and the drainage network, the stream network coming in. So anything that happens in that drainage network is going to ultimately impact the lake. The closer you are to the lake or the streams, the more there is a conduit to get that pollutant into the lake. But anything within that watershed is ultimately going to have an impact on the lake. So working at the watershed is critical, watershed scale. So that goes back to these watershed management plans Lake Winnipesaukee is working on, to basically identify where the problems are and identify what the potential solutions are. So there's various things that we're concerned about in these lake watersheds, and some of these things go beyond what we sample for in terms of our typical monitoring, but We have, in some cases, agriculture, and you don't have real large scale agriculture in the Winnipesaukee drainage, but you can have some backyard operations. Logging and construction is certainly pretty prevalent around the lake. We are seeing an increase in the number of houses, so suburbanization, septic systems over much of our state, for that matter. Not just the Winnipesaukee watershed is on private wastewater treatment, so septic systems are a concern. And anyway, this contributes a variety of different pollutants into the lake, so sediment, nutrients, toxics, and pathogens, disease-causing organisms. For our typical program, we're really focusing most on that nutrient that's driving things, which also gets at the sediment, because the nutrients coming in largely with sediment pulses, as well as things like septic systems, fertilizers, and other sources. So this is just to hit upon, some of the concerns we have as we develop the watershed. We're seeing a change in the hydrology and change in how things drain into the lake. So if we have a forested watershed, what you see typically, and it will vary too. This is just a schematic of a typical watershed. If you have a lot more rock outcrops in a watershed, you're not going to have as much infiltration as this shows. If you have more of a forest cover, you might have a little bit more. But roughly, when you have a forested landscape, what we tend to see is a significant amount of the water infiltrates the soil and comes into the lake as groundwater. So in this model, about 50% infiltrates the soil and becomes groundwater runoff. And then about 10% flows directly into streams running off into the lake. And then the rest would be evapotranspiration. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of this image, you can see if you have a more urbanized setting, significantly more overland runoff. So that water's picking up pollutants running off. And it's also running off in a more concentrated fashion. So real rapid pulses of real high volume runoff, significantly less infiltration and less evapotranspiration. So the hydrology's shifted. And we do have things we can do to manage these sorts of changes with stormwater management that can be put in place. Measures, but unfortunately, a lot of the things we did historically didn't consider those things adequately. So we're a little bit behind the game in terms of trying to do retrofits and fix things. So that's one of the things like Winnipesaukee Alliance is trying to work with communities on is trying to mitigate some of these through some retrofits. Raindrops are pretty powerful as they come down. We don't necessarily think of it as they bounce off our head. It might be an inconvenience getting us wet, but they do have a lot of power to them. So I'm just going to show you, this is my house. And what this is the drip edge right off the roof here. And I'm using my cursor just to show. There's a quarter to show you the scale. I took this picture probably 15 years ago. So I've done some stormwater management, but it still could use more. But anyway, off the drip edge here, the roof, the water came down, it impacted the driveway, and you can see it's displaced the smaller particles. The sand's been displaced, and all the fines in there, the ultra fines, which are the silts, the clays, they've been displaced off site. And with that, you end up with a lot of phosphorus runoff. So you not only get the sediment load, but you're also getting the phosphorus load. Fortunately, I have some vegetation along the side of my driveway capturing that. So that's a good thing. But obviously all this erosion here is troubling. So something I'm working on to manage from a standpoint, certainly has some environmental impacts, but certainly hits the pocketbook too, trying to maintain a driveway like this. So anything you can do to try to fix these runoff issues are advantageous. This was a image during a construction activity, and I try to use examples that are close to home. I don't want to point the finger at anybody. We can all probably do a little bit around our houses for improvements, but this was the university over here at UNH in Durham. It was our engineering building. It was being expanded, and the engineering firm that was contracted to do this didn't have the proper plan in place to put down some type of erosion control matting. So they put in the new sidewalk, and you can see wherever there's a depression here between successive sidewalk blocks, the water concentrated and ran off. And that's a very gentle slope. But again, there's a lot of runoff here that could potentially have adverse impacts. They did come back and put down some geotextile fabric, which is basically some material that helps hold things in place, which in reality should have been done before this was identified as a problem. But anyway, there are things, the good news is there are things that can be done to fix these issues. The bad news is here is that this was designed without putting that measure in place up front. So we're talking phosphorus and algal growth, and this also includes the cyanobacteria. Phosphorus, as we already discussed, is limiting for most fresh waters. It's the driving nutrient for growth, but it also tends to be sticky from a standpoint. It binds with other particles. So whenever you have particles running off into the lake, sediments, and any other organic matter, it's bringing in a lot of phosphorus. This is an image that was taken over at Bow Lake and in a kind of a impounded area of the lake, and this was a cyanobacteria bloom. But anyway, here you can also see a nice lawn. So they had some issues there, and this is just a microscopic photo showing you some of the growth that you get when you get the excessive nutrient runoff. And actually, even in a healthy system, you're going to have some level of these algae and even cyanobacteria, but it's in a more equilibrated state, so it's not growing out of control. This is a pair of images. So this image here to the image to the right, this little branch coming off, that's this right here. But the reason I'm showing this was during the cyanobacteria outbreak that occurred in Winnipesaukee back in June 2024. We were sitting, I was out with our group over at Alton Sampling on Lake Winnipesaukee, and we were just relaxing and chatting on the shorefront for about an hour. And over a 45-minute span from 10:47 to 11:28, you could see the cyanobacteria starting to accumulate on the shoreline. And I had to get really close to get this image to make it stand out. And then by 11:28 later in the day, I could stand much further back, and you could see how much denser it is. But these blooms can occur pretty rapidly, and this was wind driven along the shoreline. But it just shows you in a matter of just less than an hour, things can change tremendously. A lot of these cyanobacteria, they grow really rapidly. So over the course of the day, they can grow exponentially. So this was probably driven mostly by the wind action blowing in the shore. But over the course of a day, things can start growing tremendously and start greening as well. So measurements we're looking at in terms of the water quality monitoring typically are Secchi transparency. I'm going to actually just change so you can see. Sorry about that. I'm going to share again. Realize screen 2. Hopefully. Wow. Is that better? Bigger image?
Yep. Yeah, that's full screen.
Okay. So sorry about that. So the Secchi transparency is the primary parameter we're measuring, and that'll reflect how clear the water is. It's a composite reflection of how many particulates are in the water and how tea-colored the water is. So it doesn't tell us what's impacting the water transparency, but it gives us some idea that things are changing. Secondly, we have chlorophyll A, so the pigment associated with photosynthetic activity. That includes, photosynthetic activity of both the cyanobacteria and your more normal algae in the water column. But it's a good indicator that things are becoming greener, more growth in the water column. Total phosphorus. So as we've already discussed, limiting nutrient in most fresh waters. Once in a while, there's exception with dealing with the environment, there's always exceptions to the rules, particularly with ecology, but phosphorus tends to be the driver. Dissolved color, that's another thing we're measuring. So as we filter those chlorophyll samples onto little filter discs, we retain the filtrate, the water that's been purified through the real fine mesh filter, and that's our true color. So how tea-colored the water effectively is. And tea color is a reflection of decomposition around the periphery of the lake and in the wetlands. So if you have a lot of wetlands around your particular lake or your area of Lake Winnipesaukee in this case, you're going to tend to have more tea-colored water. Tea-colored water also varies tremendously from wet versus dry years. So on wetter years, oftentimes we see significantly more tea-colored water. And in turn, we also see shallower water transparencies. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Then other parameters that not everybody's collecting are dissolved oxygen. So some groups do collect those. And those really have an implication for your fishery habitat. So whether or not you can support cold water fish in your area of the lake, and also for water chemistry. So as oxygen goes out, the chemistry changes such that things that under oxygenated conditions kind of settle out of the water, like nutrients, they'll bind with other particles and settle to the lake bottom. Under anoxic conditions, they can come back into solution and stimulate growth. The other things I'm really going to not focus on today, but nitrogen can be a driver of, limited growth, and also the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus can have implications for cyanobacteria blooms. pH, so how acidic the water is something people oftentimes ask. And I'll just say broadly that Lake Winnipesaukee and the lakes within the watershed, pH is plus or minus neutral, so it's not a big problem around Winnipesaukee. Specific conductivity, so it's measuring the dissolved particles in the water. It's highly correlated to road salt runoff, so to chloride. And what we have been seeing among lakes throughout the state is conductivity has been increasing over the decades. So I'm not going to really focus on that today, but we do know that conductivities are going up, and we also do see some areas that are more urbanized around Winnipesaukee that have higher chloride concentrations. So we are seeing the impacts of some of this higher developed areas. And then turbidity, which is just a measure of the scattering of light associated with particles in the water. Turbidities are normally pretty low in Winnipesaukee, with the exception of when you have things like the cyanobacteria blooms that typically you can see with the naked eye, and also with the streams. If you have a rainfall event, you can really pick up elevated turbidity. And around the periphery of the lake, if we were closer to the shoreline, we'd probably see some elevated turbidities, particularly during those storm events. All right, so here's Lake Winnipesaukee, the watershed, and I include Paugus Bay down here. So depending on whether or not you include Winnipesaukee, that's a subject of debate. But anyway, this map does. So Winnipesaukee watershed, from the standpoint of doing the watershed management plans that have been done or just finishing up for the entire Winnipesaukee watershed, it's broken down into these sub watersheds that are based on U.S. Geological Survey. So I'm going to be talking about some of the data in the context of these sub watersheds. So it's a way of managing the data a little bit. But obviously, with a lake like Winnipesaukee, water is exchanging from one area to another. So keep in mind that what goes on at one end of the lake could make its way to the opposite end of the lake as well. So this is a 2024 highlight report. I don't have the 2025s available yet. So I just want to give a heads up. Once they're available, they will be posted on the website. So they are broken down by those sub watersheds. So this one is the highlight report for Alton Bay. What each highlight report does is has a little pie in the upper right hand corner that it's kind of an assessment tool for what we consider four of the primary parameters: color, secuous transparency, total phosphorus, and chlorophyll. And depending on where the lake is along that eutrophication scale, basically how nutrient enriched or how aged the lake is, it's going to be color coded. So blue is oligotrophic, so that's the low end of the nutrient enrichment. So a very young lake. So that's where most of Winnipesaukee stands. Light green would be the middle-aged lake, and then dark green would be the more aged lake. These reports also include these data are the same as up in the pie, but then we also have the accessory parameters. So color, how colored the lake is. So you have your absolute values for a lake, and then what the coding is. If it's uncolored to the naked eye, slightly colored, lightly tea-colored, so on and so forth, that would be here. And then for alkalinity, pH, and conductivity, it gives measurements as well. I didn't mention alkalinity while I was talking about the overall data, but that's another parameter. It's a secondary parameter that's collected, but that's your mineral buffering capacity in the lake. That would be equivalent to us taking a Tums tablet if we had an upset stomach. Well, lakes have a natural amount of alkalinity or Tums, if you will, to neutralize the acid inputs. And right now, the levels, they're low on a national standard, but by New Hampshire standards, they're right around average, maybe a little bit above average. We're considered the granite state. Granite doesn't give off a lot of mineral, and thus we have naturally low alkalinities. Whereas other areas of the country, like Florida, the Great Lakes region, there's a lot of limestone deposits in the area. Those areas that adds a lot of mineralization. They have really high alkalinities, but alkalinity is really important from a standpoint of dealing with acid rain. This is just showing you again the Alton highlight report. So how it's laid out, we have graphs of the seasonality for Secudisc, the vertical bars. This is chlorophyll, the green line. This one is Secudisc in color. These are long-term trends, or in this case, seasonal variations. They're median values for whatever's being collected. This is Secudisc and chlorophyll. This is phosphorus and color. But anyway, the point is these reports kind of give you the overview of what's going on in your water body. Also in the sub-watersheds, there's one deep reference site that's used to give the overall assessment, and that's what these data are here. But then over here, these bar graphs, they would be your deep overall condition site, as well as any accessory sites you may sample. So this is the more open water site, for instance, from the Alton report. This is the most inner site near the pavilion, if you're familiar, downtown area of Alton. So you can see the Secudisc transparency varies among locations. This one's the phosphorus, it varies among locations. So anyway, you can begin to see the differences. And I'll kind of leave it at that, but there are these highlight reports that'll talk more than I'm capable of talking about the data today. So you can review the through the 2024 data online right now. The 2025 data reports should be posted within a month or so. All right, this is we have a website where we can do data visualizations. And it allows you to play with the data a little bit. So what I want to do is just run through this a little bit. This too only has the data through 2024 season, but it has all the historical data, so you can play with this. So it has filters that allow you to select which lake you want to work with. So I've Winnipesaukee selected. Select the sites. I have 12 sites selected, which are over here. I'm selecting the parameter, so I'm selecting total phosphorus. And these are called box plots, but you can also plot. You can get vertical bar graphs for average values and for median values. So this is showing you a box of these box plots really show you the distribution of data. And I don't want to get into it too much aside from saying these are good for seeing, how much the data are distributed from low value to a high value. This is phosphorus on this axis. So some of the values, and this is Greens Basin, for instance. I know these labels are a little tight, but this is the Greens Basin site. So we had a sample that was a little bit below 5 micrograms per liter at one point. It went all the way up to 25 micrograms per liter. Most of the data are in this box area here. But this is various sites, all from Marlborough, just looking at the differences. So there is a way for you to play with the data that you're most interested in. And this isn't limited to the Lake Winnipesaukee data. You can pull up data from the other lakes. So Kanasaka, Wentworth, so on and so forth in the watershed. If we've worked through the lake through UNH, it's going to be in this database system. You can also look at data a little differently. So this is looking at trends or just patterns. It's a scatter plot over time. So I have it selected, and this is the Greens Basin site again. You can again select the lake. You can select the site. You can filter out starting and ending years. So I started it with 2010. So this is 2010 data through 2025 data. This is just looking at it sequentially over time from 2010 to 2025. So you can view your data that way. You can also look at the the way it looks in terms of the seasonality of the data. So instead of looking at chronologically over time, the second graph down here looks at it seasonally from May data. Well, actually, this is April right here, but April through November. So are the data distributed, are any patterns showing up? In other words, from one season to another or 1 year to another, you can really start seeing it looking at these types of graphics. So now I'm going to get at the 2025 data. So this is kind of in a nutshell. I have a handful of graphs that I'll walk you through. But what I wanted to do is just composite all the data that we had. So this is Secudus transparency on the y-axis. X-axis is chlorophyll. So the higher the number here, the clearer the water. The higher the number down here on the x-axis, the greener the water. And what you can see is there's a lot of scatter here at the really clear end of the spectrum. But clear end of the spectrum, you can see the chlorophyll levels are lower. As you start getting less transparent, you can see the values starting to increase. And again, there is a correlation between Secudus transparency and chlorophyll, but it's not a cause and effect per se. It's not a one-to-one relationship. The more phosphorus you add, the greener a lake will become in general terms, but there's other factors contributing to what can grow as well. But these types of graphs are good at just kind of giving you a baseline of, if you have high transparency, what are your chlorophyll looking like? They're pretty low. So transparency in itself can give you some idea of, if there's potentially higher chlorophyll or not. It's not going to tell you in absolute terms, but if you have really high Secudus transparency, you're probably going to have really low chlorophyll levels. This is again looking at Secudus transparency and your color concentrations. And as you can see, once again, high transparency up here, you're going to have really low color concentrations. As transparency is going down, you can see color can really drive the transparency lower. So that's something to keep in mind. So in some lakes, and this level up here, or the levels of 40 to 60, that's going to be pretty yellow water to the naked eye. And the yellower the water, the more it's going to absorb light, keep it from penetrating deeper. So you are going to have naturally lower transparencies as your color increases. So for instance, if you're on Lake Winnipesaukee and you're up in the Greens Basin area, really up in the Molten Borough, you're going to have more tea color. You're going to have less transparent water just based on that color concentration. It also does tend to have some chlorophyll, elevated chlorophyll up there, but color can really drive things. We've also see that happen down in Alton, near the Mirror River, where it discharges into the lake during really intense storm events. Tremendous amounts of tea-colored water can pulse in and really have an impact on your transparency. This graph is showing, again, the 2025 season data. Now we're showing chlorophyll on the y-axis. So the higher the number, the higher the chlorophyll, and then total phosphorus on the x-axis. And you can see when there's really low phosphorus, there's obviously some scatter here, but chlorophyll tends to be low when there's low phosphorus. As the phosphorus goes up, so does the chlorophyll, generally speaking. But then again, there are some exceptions. So here's some elevated phosphorus. We're not getting a response to the chlorophyll. So this really shows you that you have to be careful with how you interpret any individual data point. We really like to look at the collective of measurements. And that's why we have people collecting the phosphorus, chlorophyll, color data on each sampling event, as well as the phosphorus. It's really critical to have the multiple measurements to be able to understand what's going on. So now I'm going to get at kind of looking at some of the general data from select sampling locations on Winnipesaukee. So I'm going to use this broad site over in Gilmanton, this deep site, about 150 feet plus or minus. We're going to look at this Meredith Bay off Bear Island site. We're going to look at this Tuftonboro deep site off Little Bear Island, the other island in the islands in the area here. And then we'll look at this Wolfboro site over near Wolfboro Bay. And all these sites are pretty deep. So these sites are getting 80 to 100 foot or so, 80 to 100 foot or in excess of that. So this is a graph of the first deep site I was showing you out towards the Broads, that Guilford deep site. It's about 150 feet, 140, 150 feet deep. This is showing you data from 2010 to 2025. Whoops, I'm using my cursor on the wrong screen. This is showing you the Secudus transparency, which is on this showed on this axis, then chlorophyll A, which is over on this axis, two different scales. But Secudus transparency, these are median values between 2010 and 2025. So this does include your data from last year. And then chlorophyll A content, 2010 through 2025. And you can see there's no definitive, just to the naked eye, no definitive change in terms of where things are going, things increasing, decreasing, in terms of just looking at it on a linear scale from year to year. Chlorophyll spiked a little bit in the last couple of years, but overall it's remained pretty low. But this gives you some sense that last year, things were not out of whack. And I should also step back and say that FB Environmental is coming out. They put out your watershed management reports, and they look at things a little differently. So we're looking at annual trends here. They're clustering data in 10-year increments, because when you start blocking data in larger groups, it allows you to analyze things a little differently. And with that type of grouping, you can see that things are changing. Things have, in many instances, gotten a little less transparent, a little bit greener at certain areas of Winnipesaukee. But just looking at it on a linear scale, there's so much noise of things going up and down, it's a little bit harder to see. So the good news is things are still looking really good at sites like this Guilford site. But long term, we are starting to see some basic changes in water quality. And I'd urge anybody to look at your individual watershed management plan reports, which are looking at the data a little bit differently, looking at those clusters of data over those bigger time sequence, which really does give you some perspective of how things are changing. And we have so many things going on. We have, construction in the watershed. We have retrofits of some of the historical things that weren't done well to improve things. We have climate change with things becoming a little bit more intense with weather events in terms of more rainfall. We've had some of the warmer summers. All these things are having an influence on what's going on. So clustering data into bigger groupings can be advantageous to kind of view what's going on. So again, this is still that Guilford deep site. This is total phosphorus on the left-hand side, and then dissolved color on the right-hand side. And again, there's noise from year to year, but just with the naked eye, you don't see a definitive change in things. But this is the importance of getting long-term data and doing some of those watershed management plan reports every decade or every 2 decades to really have another way of looking at the data. And that also does sometimes composite data from multiple locations, whereas I'm right now just looking at a deep site here. So this is the Meredith Bay deep site, or Meredith deep site off of Bear Island. But again, what you can see is things have varied among years. And this is, again, Secudus transparency. So the upper graph, the upper line, and the lower line is the chlorophyll A content. So things have varied from year to year. And these, again, are median values. So these are taking the data and compositing them into one median value. I don't have a scatter plot of the data. If I had a scatter plot, you'd see the points would vary. This is just a median, so there'd be some values above, some below. But this is a common way of looking at data, is breaking it down to the median value. And some may wonder why we don't use the average values. And average values are another way of certainly looking at these sorts of things. But if there's an outlier data point, it's going to heavily influence the average value, whereas the median value, it has a more minimal impact. So that's really the reason for using median. It's not to say the average isn't also important to look at, or for that matter, the individual data points, but medians are good for getting an overall baseline of what's going on. But again, with this, you can see it's similar to the other deep site. There's some variations, but things are still looking pretty good. Looks like Secudus was really low last year, and last year was a really wet year. or 2024 was a really wet year. 2025 was a drier year. But one of the things we did find with looking at the data from some of the other lakes, while last year was really dry as a whole, it was pretty wet from April through the very beginning of June, really, really heavy rainfall in May. And that may have had some influence to impact the transparency, because as dry as it was last year, in some ways I thought it was going to be, higher transparency just with all that lack of runoff during the summer months. But, sometimes it's other times of the season that'll also have an impact. Again, here's your Meredith Bay, or the Bear Island, phosphorus and color. And again, you can see things are varying from year to year, but things are, no definitive trends to the naked eye. If I ran a regression line through this, getting at statistics, it wouldn't statistically be significant. If there was any change, it would be negligible, probably due to climatic variables from year to year. One thing to consider too is, as you're looking at this is total phosphorus here on your left. 6 micrograms per liter is right here. 8 micrograms per liter is a cutoff between an oligotrophic, so a young lake, and a mesotrophic lake, the middle-aged lake. You're still around 6 micrograms per liter or less overall from year to year. So you're in still really good shape, but things do certainly vary from year to year. This is the Tuftonboro Deep site. So getting over towards Little Bear Island, we don't have as long of a time period where this site was sampled. And I should say, I didn't necessarily pick the sites that were sampled for the longest periods of time. I picked the deeper sites that are oftentimes used as the reference sites for the overall condition of those particular areas of Winnipesaukee. So we do have some data that go back to 83 for some of the sites, even 81 for some of the sites. So there are longer trend lines that I could have put in for some, but I chose these sites because these are oftentimes used as primary sites when doing the watershed management plans. But again, what you can see is there's some variation among years. Transparency is hovering around 8 meters plus or minus the median values from year to year. And in this case, chlorophyll is well under 2. The cutoff for a middle-aged lake is about 3.3 for chlorophyll. So so again, Winnipesaukee is looking pretty good. Definitely the last 2 years, it was a little bit greener. 2024, again, the wet year. 2025 might be that wet spring, or maybe even residual from 2024. Hard to say. But long-term data are really critical to really discerning the long-term trend from the short-term noise, those intermittent oscillations that occur throughout a particular season, but also among years. Winnipesaukee Tuftonboro site, again, a little bit of variation, but things are looking, looking pretty good. And then finally, Wolfboro Bay, or the out more of the open waters just outside of Wolfboro Bay. But Secchi disc last 2 years a little bit lower. This is kind of common among the sites, although chlorophyll is also lower. So it does show you here too that Secchi disc and chlorophyll aren't always, there's not a one-to-one relationship. 1 point of Secchi disc decrease doesn't mean 1 point of chlorophyll increase. There's other factors at play as well, but things are still looking pretty good. Interestingly, at Wolfboro, for whatever reason, back in 2025, we did have a little bit greener water there above that 3.3 threshold for the difference, the delineation between a really young lake and a middle-aged lake. Don't know exactly what happened there. It could have been a drawdown of Wentworth or Crescent Lake that flushed a lot of water into the more open waters. Who knows? Any number of things could have been at play, but having these data to compare among locations of Winnipesaukee and over time are really critical to trying to get a handle on what's going on. And getting a handle can be difficult too, because it takes a lot of analysis and probably want to have a lot of people sitting down together to talk about their thoughts on what's going on. So again, Winnipesaukee over at Wolfboro area, last couple of years, phosphorus is a little bit higher. Color remains the same, but nothing alarmingly high. Still, phosphorus before was around actually below 5 up until the last 2024 and 2025. Now it's around 6. That could be weather impacts, oscillations, but time will tell. One of the things I'm not showing you on here is we saw this over at one of our sites over at Long Island. And it's a site that went inactive, but we had about a 25-year of continuous data. And what we saw are these, I'm just going to use my cursor to show, but like oscillations, like a sine wave, where it went up and down over roughly 5-year cycles. And we didn't know what was driving that. I mean, we didn't look really closely at the weather at that particular time, but sometimes there are cycles where maybe it's a wet year one year and it cycles through it. The all that material that pulses into the lake takes a while to decompose, stimulate growth, and then it reequilibrates, rebalances. So there are some things that sometimes we can't explain, but again, having these data among these locations are really critical. I did want to kind of hit one more thing and then open it up to questions. Not everybody's doing this, but when you go out, or a typical volunteer goes out, with the exception of a few shallow sites that are so shallow, we just do an elbow grab. So basically a sample at a depth of about a half a meter deep. Most volunteers are collecting at least a temperature profile. So what they're doing is figuring out where the extent of this epilimnion is, or this is a jargon term, but excuse me, just means the upper warm water layer. We want to sample it at upper warm water layer. And that warm water layer is above a zone of rapid temperature decrease. So during the summer months, this would be your swimming zone effectively. If you dive deeper, you might dive into this cold zone, which is your metalimnion or thermocline, so rapidly decreasing temperatures. Then bottom cold water layer. For the purpose of the data that I showed you, we're really focusing on the upper warm water layer. So that's your chlorophyll, phosphorus, and color data I just showed you. The Secchi disk could have extended into this middle lake layer, but the Secchi disk is just reflecting how transparent the water is overall. For the purposes of what most volunteers are doing, we're not really dealing with this bottom cold water layer, but the exception to that is if we're doing oxygen sampling. So we have just a handful of volunteers that have been out with the oxygen meters at this point. And what I'm going to do is show you a graph that's kind of circles around the lake. So it's going to show you data from Alton, this Guilford site, this site over at Governor's Island, going to the Meredith Bay, over the Bear Island, so on and so forth, around the lake, and ending up over here at Winnipesaukee, near the Wolfboro Bay. Deep water oxygen can be really important from the lake chemistry standpoint, where you're getting what we call internal nutrient loading. And it's certainly really important from your fishery. So your cold water fish, whether or not it's suitable habitat for them. So what we have here, these are late season measurements, average levels in average concentrations of dissolved oxygen. So that's what's on your y-axis here. Your numbers are above here. So these are average values in that deep bottom cold water layer. So from Alton Bay sites over to the Center Harbor site, these are measurements August 7th to September 4th, depending on the sites that were sampled. So this was August 7th from Alton Deep site. This was the September 4th, and the rest of these, the rest of them in between were, I think, the 21st of August through the 25th. So a pretty narrow band of days, because things will change seasonally in terms of the deep water oxygen. So later in the season you go, the lower the oxygen you'd expect to have deep water. But most of the lake, you can see, has really high water. So these sites over here to the left of the Moltenboro Bay deep site number 2 have really high concentrations. Those are all really, really good for your salmonoid species, your trout and salmon. But when you get up in here into the Moltenboro sites, you're seeing the numbers get pretty low, particularly this Moltenboro deep site. This site is at a point where you may be getting a little bit of internal nutrient loading. That's the nutrient coming back into solution from the sediments. But the other sites, with the possible exception, this one's getting pretty close, the Wolfboro deep site. But the other sites are above those thresholds. And most of the sites are really conducive to a very healthy cold water fishery. In the spring and fall, once the lake mixes from top to bottom, the oxygen replenishes throughout the water column, and then you'll have your salmonoid species throughout the lake. But in the summer months, particularly late summer months, at these sites over here, you're probably going to see an absence or at least a reduced number and reduced health of your cold water fish species. Um, and with that, this is just an image. Does anybody know what this material is out here? So this is a question. This is the last slide I have. This is in Alton Bay back in 2023. The date's down here, July 19th. So it is in the summer. You can see our oak leaves here out. So it's not ice chunks. This was after the big storm event that came through in 2023. It came through maybe the 17th, but it had a washout in Alton of a bridge that washed out, actually a couple of bridges. And the water was flowing so turbulently from the Merrimack River into Alton Bay that lake foam developed. So we tend to see lake foam on the shorelines. You can see it in streams. Well, this is residual lake foam. And this is hundreds of yards away from the mouth of the Merrimack River, even a couple of days after the stream stopped flowing. The stream was still flowing, but that tremendous, volume of water stopped coming through there. But this is lake foam. So it just shows you the impact that these crazy storm events can have. And I don't have a graph that shows you the data from this site, but we call this the pavilion site, so the Alton Bay Pavilion out here. But there's a site out here about 27 feet deep, and in the summer, a typical summer, the color concentration is about 10 to 20 in there. So it's perceptible with the naked eye, but it's not really tea colored. After that storm event, the number was around 100, because Merrimack Marsh is just a giant wetland system that gets really, really stained, really brown stained water due to the decomposition of the organic matter. Well, anyway, the color of the water in here was brown after that rainfall event, just showing you the tremendous volume of water coming in. The phosphorus spiked tremendously. The Sankey disk went way down. So this was an example here that I don't have the data for to show you right now, but where the impact from that one storm event was tremendous on this particular sampling date that took place. Actually, our team was out there on July 19th. I happened to be driving by and snapped this photo. But those are the data I have to cover in terms of the presentation. But I can certainly talk about any data. Again, it's hard to show you with as many sites as you have to show you every single site, the data. It's really difficult to display. It's easier to do it one-on-one with everybody.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. We did have one question
Go
in
ahead,
the
Maya.
chat. Eric asked, does recreation on the lake help with cyano mitigation or keep the water moving around versus stagnation, or does it make it worse by dispersing any cyano to multiple locations?
That's a difficult one, but I would say certainly, around the periphery, you get into the shallower areas, or even some of the more open areas. If it's shallow enough, your motors can be resuspending things, storing them up. Once you hit that thermocline zone, it really does create a pretty good barrier to mixing because of the thermal gradient. Colder water is denser, down to about 4 degrees Celsius. So if you get deeper down, that really does help create a barrier to mixing. So I'd say a big issue is around the shoreline or the shallower areas where you're resuspending things. And that not only includes particles that are nutrient enriched, but you could also have cyanobacteria mats that you could be displacing. There could be some right on the periphery of that thermocline, that zone of rapid temperature decrease. Sometimes you get cyanobacteria that layer out right there. So you could be disturbing them too. So I think those are the things that would be the biggest impacts. And obviously you're getting closer to the shore. And this could be any particular boat that could be doing it. But if you're getting too close to shore, that wave erosion, particularly if it's a high water event or a low water event, basically a drought condition or a really wet period, sometimes the water level fluctuates. and you're exposing different shoreline to the wave action, that can also exacerbate the problem, just eroding additional particles into the water.
Thanks, Bob. There is one more question. It is, well, two, I guess. The first is, what is the difference between water clarity and turbidity?
Sure. So turbidity, so when you're doing a turbidity measurement, the device basically sends a beam of light through the water, and any particles in there are the beam of light will hit the particles, and then it measures them at a 90-degree angle. So it resets the direction of those particles. So you're measuring the particles in the water when you're measuring turbidity. So clarity is really more of a visual thing to the naked eye, but it's picking up on both the turbidity of the water, but also the just the natural dissolved materials in the water. So that could be the tea color that we see. At certain times of the year, it could be iron. Iron precipitates out pretty quickly. It binds with other particles under an oxygenated environment. But for short term, it could be in the water column. But that's the big difference. Turbidity is the particles, whereas the transparency is what you see in the water, which is your particles, as well as the dissolved component, whatever's coloring the water.
There's one more question. How can we best explain, and I can help too, Bob, but I'll let you take a stab at it first, is how can we best explain to the general public what they can watch for and be concerned with and report in the lake during the spring and summer season? So I think this is cyanobacteria focused. Brenda, please correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, Bob, do you want to take a stab and I can fill in?
Sure.
She said correct.
So I mean, things that the general public can look for is first and foremost, I think anybody that sees a difference in clarity, they'll pick up on that. So that could be from their dock, that could be at the deep side of the lake. Just looking down, a person dives in the lake, you can't see them down as much. Once you start seeing something like that, you might want to just question what it is, and then I'd say probably talk to the LWA, call Bree or call Maya, let them know. I'm certainly accessible too, but they're your local contacts there. And if you're in one of the other lakes in the watershed, call a representative from those lake associations as well. But changes in transparency will certainly be a thing to look for. And then scums along the surface. So in the spring, you're gonna certainly have pollen, and oftentimes with the pollen, you also have some level of cyanobacteria, and oftentimes it's a mix. Sometimes it can be dominated by the cyanobacteria or the pollen. But when you start having accumulations, and oftentimes they show up on the shoreline, again, reach out to your local contacts, let them know. These are things we see pretty commonly. During the summer months, you can have things that are occurring too, and you can have things like gliotrichia. They kind of look like fuzzy balls in the water column. But that's a type of cyanobacteria that people pick up on, and that's within the water column, and they're big enough to see with the naked eye as individual clusters, but also any surface scums you see along the shoreline or in the deep areas. Sometimes the cyanobacteria can form bands, and it's not just the cyanobacteria that can cause the green water events. There are other things too, but cyanobacteria are a thing that come up more often than not. I think those are some of the things around the periphery of the lake too, particularly in swimming areas. Things that come up are things like if you have unusual amounts of vascular plant growth, which are what people refer to as the weeds, you might want to contact somebody. Some of that's just natural fluctuations, but if you have some area that had a recent erosion event, you might have displaced a lot of silt that's now stimulating plant beds that weren't there before. And there are cyanobacteria mats that can form around the periphery that if you're looking down, it just looks like discolored bottom water, whether it's brown or green. It doesn't look like something you really want to walk through. So those are types of things that I think would be helpful. I'll turn it over to Bree.
No, that was great, Bob. Thanks. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about cyanobacteria and the resources that LWA has available. So the Department of Environmental Services should always be your point of contact for reporting any cyanobacteria blooms, but I put our website in the chat and specifically the cyanobacteria page. So that is run by LWA. It gives a little bit of background on cyanobacteria. It also links to the DES reporting tool, their hotline, their email. It has DES's Healthy Swimming Mapper, which is what they update on a weekly basis throughout the summer, showing both cyanobacteria bloom observation that they've been able to take samples with, which LWA helps coordinate, as well as E. coli for beaches. And then it's got some additional resources in there as well in terms of what to look for cyanobacteria or what cyanobacteria can look like. There's a guidance document on that page. And then in addition to those resources on LWA's YouTube page, we have a few different recorded presentations that we've done or other experts have done about cyanobacteria and what to be on the lookout for, including some of the photos from the 2024 blooms on Winnipesaukee, which were certainly some of the worst. So there's resources out there. If you have questions or need to get the links to those, please let me or Maya know. The other thing that I will say is that over the past couple of years, LWA has been working with the town of Moultonborough and the town of Meredith for their conservation commissions and creating what we're calling cyanobacteria committees. As part of that, those two cyanobacteria committees are in charge of helping to train people, know what to look for, and to be a main point of contact. So there's some resources in those towns as well. One of the two major facets of those committees is to create groups called cyanobacteria watchers, which are just people that have done the training either through the YouTube or through our local resources to be able to identify cyanobacteria and provided their contact information. So say we do have somebody that calls us and says, hey, I think I have a cyanobacteria bloom on my shorefront, or calls DES, but they're not able to get back to them for whatever reason. You know, maybe their phone's on silent or out on the boat and they're not answering, but we want to be able to go check out that area. But because of Winnipesaukee shoreline, most of it being private property, we are getting groups of people together to be able to have different watchers in each of those locations. So happy to share more about that. Just please feel free to contact Meyer and I and give you an additional information.
Awesome. Thanks, Bray. And does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourselves. All right. Well, I think that concludes our session for today. So I just wanted to thank everyone so much for coming, getting all the information. And if you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. And thank you so much for Bob for putting this presentation together. It was really great to see it all come together. And if you guys have any questions as well for the season as the summer starts, feel free. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you need anything or something breaks. No worries. We can get it figured out. So yeah, hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.